I'm 71 years old, and I'm dying of liver disease that the doctors say came from 42 years of drinking away the guilt of knowing that my survival came at the cost of destroying the most heroic soul who ever walked the Olympic mountains. Before this disease takes what little time I have left, I need someone to know about Magnus, about the night of September 23rd, 1982, when he stood between me and a man who'd kidnapped me with plans that would have ended in my death, and about how my grateful testimony to law enforcement led federal agents to the being whose only crime was choosing to protect a terrified woman when human civilization had failed to ensure my safety. My name is Rebecca Stone, and back then I was 29 years old, a nurse working the late shift at Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles, completely unaware that David Hartley had been watching me for 3 months while planning an abduction that would fulfill fantasies he'd been developing since his release from Washington State Penitentiary 6 weeks earlier. Hartley had served 8 years for aggravated assault and attempted rape, and his parole officer would later admit that warning signs had been ignored because of bureaucratic incompetence and caseload pressure that made adequate supervision impossible. The kidnapping happened at 11:30 p.m. on September 22nd, as I walked to my car in the hospital parking lot after a 12-hour shift that had left me exhausted and distracted. Hartley approached from behind with a chloroform-soaked cloth that rendered me unconscious before I could scream for help, then loaded me into a stolen van that he'd equipped with restraints and soundproofing designed for prolonged captivity of victims, who wouldn't be found until their bodies surfaced in locations far from where their ordeals had taken place. I regained consciousness 6 hours later in a remote cabin that Hartley had prepared for activities he'd been fantasizing about during years of imprisonment, equipped with chains, cameras, and implements that made clear he intended to document torture before eventually disposing of evidence that might connect him to my disappearance. The cabin was located deep in Olympic National Forest, 40 miles from the nearest road, and 60 miles from any human habitation that might provide assistance if I somehow managed to escape his immediate control. "You're going to be here for a while," Hartley told me while testing the restraints that secured me to a bed he'd modified specifically for holding victims who would provide entertainment during extended periods of isolation in wilderness that swallowed screams without leaving echoes that might guide rescue operations to their source. "I've got plans for us that are going to take time to complete, and I want to make sure you understand that nobody's looking for you in the right places, and nobody's going to find you until I'm finished with what I need to do." Hartley's psychological profile, which I'd read during court proceedings years later, revealed someone who combined intelligence with sadistic impulses that had been refined during decades of planning increasingly elaborate scenarios for capturing and torturing victims whose suffering would provide satisfaction that conventional relationships had never offered. He'd chosen me specifically because my work schedule was predictable, my social connections were limited, and my disappearance wouldn't trigger immediate investigation by people who understood that time was critical for victim survival. But Hartley had made one crucial miscalculation in his planning. The remote cabin he'd selected for maximum isolation was located in territory that Magnus had been protecting for generations, where his people had established responsibility for ensuring that predators didn't use wilderness accessibility to exploit victims who couldn't escape or summon help from law enforcement agencies that operated dozens of miles away from locations where human monsters conducted activities that official statistics never documented. My escape happened on the second night of captivity, when Hartley's overconfidence led him to secure my restraints inadequately, while he prepared equipment for recording activities that would provide permanent documentation of torture he'd been anticipating for months. I managed to free myself from chains that should have held me indefinitely, then fled into forest so dense and dark that I was immediately lost in terrain that would probably kill me through exposure, even if I successfully avoided recapture by someone who knew these mountains far better than I did. Magnus found me 3 hours after my escape, when hypothermia and exhaustion had reduced me to crawling through underbrush that tore at clothing and skin, while Hartley's search grew systematically closer to my inadequate hiding place. I was dying slowly from exposure to mountain weather that September nights made lethal for someone wearing only the thin clothing Hartley had allowed me to retain during my captivity. And I understood that recapture was inevitable, because wilderness survival required knowledge and equipment that my suburban background had never provided. The liver disease that's killing me started forming the day I understood what happened to Magnus after he saved my life from David Hartley's torture plans. After my testimony about the large man, who'd protected me, guided federal hunters to the most compassionate being who'd ever chosen to intervene when human predators used wilderness isolation to exploit victims who had no other source of assistance. For 42 years, I've lived knowing that somewhere in underground research facilities, the soul who demonstrated heroism that most humans never find courage to attempt has spent most of his remaining life as a test subject for people who will never understand that they're studying someone whose moral wisdom surpassed anything their institutions could comprehend. The moment Magnus found me crawling through Olympic Peninsula underbrush at 3:17 a.m. on September 24, 1982, I was perhaps 30 minutes away from complete physical collapse that would have ended my escape in death from exposure, or recapture by David Hartley, whose systematic search was closing in on my location, with the methodical precision of someone who understood that wounded prey eventually stops running and waits for predators to finish what violent men start in wilderness areas where screams disappear without creating echoes that might guide rescue operations. I heard Magnus approaching through forest darkness before I saw him. Heavy footsteps that moved with remarkable stealth despite obvious size, suggesting someone who possessed both physical power and intelligence about moving through terrain without alerting prey or predators to his presence. My first assumption was terror that Hartley had found me, that my brief taste of freedom was ending in recapture, that would result in punishments for escape, that would make his original plans seem merciful by comparison. "Please don't hurt me anymore," I whispered, while trying to hide beneath fallen logs that provided inadequate concealment from someone who obviously knew these forests far better than a suburban nurse whose outdoor experience was limited to weekend camping trips in developed campgrounds with paved roads and marked trails. "I'm sorry I ran away. I'll do whatever you want if you just don't hurt me anymore." But the voice that answered my pleading was unmistakably different from Hartley's sadistic tone, carrying gentleness and concern that suggested someone motivated by protection rather than exploitation of vulnerable victims. "You're safe now," the voice said in English that was accented but perfectly clear, spoken by someone whose vocal apparatus was adapted for different sound production, but whose intelligence and compassion were immediately obvious. "The man who hurt you cannot reach you while I'm here to stand between you and harm." Magnus emerged from forest shadows like something from ancient mythology, but whose presence offered comfort rather than the terror that folklore attributed to cryptid encounters. He was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, covered in thick dark fur that made him nearly invisible against Olympic Peninsula darkness, with features that combined human intelligence with adaptations for wilderness survival that belonged in evolutionary textbooks rather than rescue operations conducted by beings whose existence challenged everything science claimed to know about consciousness and protective behavior. "Who are you?" I asked while studying Magnus's face for signs of aggression or predatory intent, and finding only expressions of concern and determination that were heartbreakingly familiar to anyone who'd ever recognized nobility in beings whose moral reasoning transcended species boundaries. "Are you human? Are you going to help me get away from the man who kidnapped me?" Magnus's response revealed both remarkable intelligence and sophisticated understanding of human psychology, trauma responses, and the kind of careful communication that frightened victims needed when rescued by sources that challenged their fundamental assumptions about what kinds of beings might choose to provide protection rather than exploitation. "I am someone who prevents predators from harming innocents when law enforcement cannot reach victims in time to provide assistance," he explained while examining my injuries and exposure symptoms with obvious medical knowledge. "You have been very brave, but now you need to let someone stronger help you survive, while we ensure that the man who hurt you never has opportunity to hurt you or anyone else again." The intelligence in Magnus's voice, combined with his obviously sophisticated understanding of criminal behavior and victim psychology, shattered every assumption I'd held about consciousness and social responsibility. This wasn't a wild animal responding to territorial threats. This was someone who'd developed complex ethical frameworks about protection, justice, and individual obligations to defend innocence regardless of personal risks such intervention might create. The man who took you is hunting for you with equipment designed for tracking wounded prey. Magnus continued while beginning first aid procedures that demonstrated medical expertise surpassing what many human professionals could provide in wilderness emergency situations. He believes that injured women cannot survive alone in these mountains, and he is correct about human capabilities, but incorrect about what kinds of assistance might be available to protect those who need protection. Magnus's treatment of my injuries revealed both gentle bedside manner and sophisticated understanding of trauma medicine that encompassed both physical damage and psychological wounds, that predatory violence inflicted on survivors who needed healing, that addressed multiple dimensions of what criminals had stolen from their victims. He cleaned and dressed cuts that Hartley's restraints had inflicted, provided medications from plants that reduced pain while fighting infection, and most importantly, offered emotional support that began restoring confidence that Hartley's torture had systematically destroyed. "You're going to survive this," Magnus assured me while constructing shelter that would protect me from mountain weather, while we planned strategies for permanently ending the threat that Hartley represented to both me and future victims he would target if escape allowed him to continue predatory activities. "What happened to you was evil. But evil does not triumph when good beings choose to intervene, rather than allowing injustice to continue unchallenged." For the first time since my kidnapping, I began believing that survival was possible, that someone with the knowledge and strength to protect me had chosen to ensure that David Hartley's fantasies would end in his capture rather than my death in wilderness that had been designed to conceal crimes that official statistics would never document. The shelter Magnus built for me that night was a masterpiece of wilderness engineering that provided warmth, security, and comfort that transformed my desperate situation from slow death by exposure into a sanctuary where healing could begin, despite the trauma that David Hartley had inflicted during 2 days of captivity designed to break my spirit before breaking my body. Using materials he gathered from the Olympic Peninsula forest, Magnus created a structure that was completely weatherproof, remarkably spacious, and equipped with innovations that demonstrated both practical knowledge and artistic sensitivity that challenged everything I thought I knew about intelligence and cultural sophistication. "This will keep you safe while your body recovers from what that man did to you," Magnus explained while demonstrating heating systems that would maintain comfortable temperatures without creating smoke or light that might guide Hartley to our location. "Your injuries need time to heal, and your spirit needs time to remember that not all beings use strength to cause harm rather than provide protection." Magnus possessed medical knowledge that surpassed anything I'd encountered during my nursing education, combining traditional pharmaceutical science with herbal preparations that addressed both physical trauma and psychological damage that violent crimes inflicted on survivors whose recovery required treatment approaches that conventional medicine had never developed. His understanding of victim psychology was particularly sophisticated, revealing someone who'd spent generations observing human behavior and developing therapeutic techniques that promoted healing rather than simply managing symptoms. "Pain has many sources," Magnus observed while preparing medicines that would address both the physical wounds Hartley had inflicted and the emotional trauma that would affect my ability to trust, love, and feel safe in situations that reminded me of helplessness I'd experienced during captivity. "Your body will heal quickly with proper care, but your heart and mind will need different medicine that helps you remember that most beings choose to protect rather than prey upon those who are vulnerable." The following days became an intensive education in survival skills, criminal psychology, and the kind of moral reasoning that had guided Magnus's people through centuries of protecting isolated humans from predators who used wilderness accessibility to exploit victims that law enforcement agencies couldn't reach in time to prevent tragedies. Magnus taught me to recognize signs of dangerous human behavior, strategies for avoiding situations that created vulnerability to predatory violence, and most importantly, techniques for maintaining psychological strength that would prevent future victimization. "Men like your kidnapper seek victims who seem weak and isolated," Magnus explained while teaching me self-defense methods that combined physical techniques with psychological awareness that would help me recognize and avoid dangerous situations before they escalated into violence. "Strength comes from understanding your own capabilities and knowing when to fight, when to flee, and when to seek assistance from beings who have power to provide protection. But beyond practical education, Magnus provided emotional support that began healing wounds to my sense of self-worth and personal safety that Hartley's torture had systematically inflicted through techniques designed to convince victims that they deserved whatever suffering their captors chose to inflict. Magnus's gentle manner and obvious respect for my autonomy helped restore confidence that predatory violence had stolen along with my physical freedom. "You are not responsible for what happened to you," Magnus assured me during conversations that addressed guilt and shame that crime victims often experienced, even when logic made clear that predators rather than their targets were responsible for choosing violence. Evil seeks to convince good people that they deserve suffering, but truth is that innocents deserve protection, and predators deserve consequences that prevent them from continuing to cause harm. Magnus's stories about his people's long history of protecting isolated humans revealed cultural traditions that combined practical knowledge with spiritual wisdom about the interconnectedness of all conscious beings and individual obligations to defend innocence regardless of species, boundaries, or personal costs such intervention might require. His people had developed sophisticated ethical frameworks that prioritized community welfare over individual advancement, protection over exploitation, and cooperation over domination. We have been guardians for longer than human civilization has existed in these mountains. Magnus told me while sharing oral histories that documented centuries of intervention in situations where human institutions had failed to protect vulnerable individuals from predatory violence. "This is not work we do for recognition or reward. This is responsibility that comes with having power to help and wisdom to recognize when help is needed." By our 4th day together, Magnus had begun planning Hartley's capture through methods that would ensure he never had opportunities to harm other women, while avoiding direct confrontation that might expose Magnus to discovery by law enforcement agencies that wouldn't understand that cryptid intervention had saved my life when human protection had failed. His strategies combined sophisticated understanding of criminal psychology with wilderness knowledge that would allow precise timing of operations designed to deliver Hartley to authorities without revealing the source of intelligence that had made his apprehension possible. "Justice requires that predators face consequences for their choices," Magnus explained while preparing for what would prove to be our final conversation, before the confrontation that would end Hartley's threat, while beginning the tragedy that would destroy the being who'd risked everything to protect me from torture and death. "Your survival means that evil did not triumph, but preventing future victims requires ensuring that this particular evil cannot continue operating." Magnus's courage as he prepared to face Hartley on my behalf was simultaneously the most beautiful expression of heroism I'd ever witnessed, and the beginning of the chain of events that would lead to his capture and imprisonment by federal agencies that saw his protective behavior as a national security threat requiring systematic elimination. Magnus's confrontation with David Hartley happened at dawn on September 28, 1982. When my kidnapper's systematic search finally led him to the area where Magnus had been protecting me for 4 days, while planning strategies that would ensure Hartley's capture without exposing cryptid intervention to law enforcement agencies that wouldn't understand that my rescue had been accomplished by someone whose existence challenged everything they thought they knew about North American wildlife and consciousness. The battle was brief but decisive, as Magnus possessed both physical capabilities and tactical intelligence that rendered Hartley's weapons and experience useless against someone whose people had been protecting isolated humans from predatory violence for countless generations. Hartley approached our shelter with confidence that reflected his assumptions about female helplessness and wilderness isolation, completely unprepared for encountering resistance that transcended anything his criminal experience had taught him to expect or overcome. "Where is she?" Hartley demanded, while searching forest areas where he'd tracked my movements during my escape, his voice carrying the sadistic anticipation of someone who'd spent days fantasizing about punishments he would inflict for my attempt to deny him the entertainment he'd planned during months of preparation for kidnapping and torture. "I know she's somewhere in these woods, and I know she can't survive much longer without help that isn't available in wilderness areas, this remote from civilization." Magnus's response was both measured and unmistakably threatening, delivered from concealment that demonstrated superior knowledge about forest movement and tactical positioning. "She is under my protection," Magnus announced with authority, that immediately changed the dynamic of what Hartley had assumed would be easy recapture of wounded prey. You will leave these mountains immediately and surrender yourself to authorities who will ensure that you never have opportunities to harm women again. Or, you will face consequences that your criminal experience has never prepared you to handle. Hartley's attempt to locate and attack the source of resistance was pathetic compared to Magnus's capabilities. As my kidnapper stumbled through terrain that Magnus navigated with perfect stealth, while systematically disabling weapons and equipment that Hartley had relied upon for maintaining control over victims who couldn't match his physical strength or wilderness knowledge. Within minutes, Hartley was disarmed, restrained, and completely helpless against someone whose moral authority was backed by overwhelming physical superiority. "What the hell are you?" Hartley screamed when Magnus finally revealed himself. This magnificent being, whose very existence challenged every assumption my kidnapper held about what kinds of resistance he might encounter in wilderness areas that seemed perfectly designed for concealing criminal activities from law enforcement intervention. "You're not human. You're some kind of monster." Magnus's response revealed both his remarkable restraint and his sophisticated understanding of justice, criminal psychology, and the difference between punishment that served community protection versus revenge that satisfied personal anger. "I am someone who prevents monsters like you from harming innocents," Magnus replied, while preparing to transport Hartley to authorities who could ensure appropriate legal consequences without requiring cryptid exposure to judicial proceedings. "You are the monster in this situation, and monsters face justice when beings with conscience choose to intervene, rather than allowing evil to continue unchallenged." But Hartley's capture created complications that Magnus hadn't anticipated, as my kidnapper's detailed description of his attacker provided law enforcement with information about cryptid characteristics, territorial boundaries, and protective behavior that federal agencies had been seeking for decades to validate reports about unknown hominid populations operating throughout Pacific Northwest wilderness areas. Instead of focusing investigative attention on Hartley's crimes, authorities became obsessed with identifying and locating the large individual, who demonstrated capabilities that challenged official understanding of what kinds of beings might exist in supposedly well-documented ecosystems. The witness describes an entity approximately 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur, demonstrating advanced intelligence and sophisticated understanding of criminal behavior, reported Agent Morrison during federal briefings that would never appear in congressional oversight or public records. This represents potential confirmation of cryptid populations that pose both strategic opportunities and security risks requiring immediate investigation and possible containment. My rescue had been accomplished, but the price was exposure of Magnus's existence to exactly the institutional forces that his people had spent centuries avoiding, through absolute secrecy and careful non-interference with human affairs. My survival had triggered federal hunting operations that would systematically eliminate protective presence from wilderness areas where beings like Magnus had provided assistance that official statistics never documented. "You must be very careful about how you describe your rescue to investigators," Magnus warned me during our final conversation before his departure from my life. "There are people in your government who wouldn't understand that my intervention saved your life, and who would see my existence as a threat requiring elimination rather than a resource deserving protection and respect." But I was a 29-year-old woman whose understanding of institutional power and federal authority had been shaped by television shows and newspaper articles that portrayed government agencies as heroic organizations dedicated to protecting innocent citizens from exactly the kind of predatory violence I'd experienced. When investigators asked detailed questions about my rescue, when they demanded comprehensive descriptions of the individual who'd saved my life, when they emphasized the importance of citizen cooperation with federal research into unusual wildlife activity, I told them everything about Magnus's protective intervention with the grateful honesty of someone who wanted to ensure that heroes received the recognition they deserved. My detailed testimony about Magnus's location, behavioral patterns, and obvious intelligence provided exactly the information that federal hunting teams needed to systematically track and capture the being whose only crime was choosing to protect me when human civilization had failed to ensure my safety from predators who used wilderness isolation to exploit victims beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. November 15, 1982, was the day my grateful cooperation with federal investigators led Agent Morrison's hunting teams to the cave system, where Magnus had been providing sanctuary for his extended family, while continuing to protect isolated humans throughout Olympic Peninsula wilderness from predators who used remote locations to exploit victims beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The operation was coordinated through intelligence that combined my detailed descriptions of Magnus's protective behavior with satellite surveillance that had been systematically mapping thermal signatures, indicating large mammal populations in areas where official science claimed no such beings could exist. We've located the primary target and what appears to be an entire community of unknown hominid entities. Morrison reported during operational briefings that classified Magnus's family as valuable biological assets rather than conscious beings whose capture would destroy social structures that had existed for generations before human colonization of Pacific Northwest territories. The subjects demonstrate advanced intelligence, sophisticated protective behavior, and territorial organization that represents both strategic research opportunities and potential security threats requiring comprehensive federal containment. I was providing victim impact testimony to prosecutors preparing David Hartley's case when federal agents surrounded Magnus's mountain sanctuary with equipment designed for capturing dangerous wildlife rather than arresting individuals suspected of criminal activity. Tranquilizer weapons designed for subduing large, intelligent mammals were deployed simultaneously against beings who offered no violence beyond desperate attempts to protect their children from seizure by people who saw them as research specimens rather than families with the same rights to freedom and safety that human communities expected from law enforcement agencies. Magnus was partially conscious when they loaded him into the containment vehicle, and through my testimony that had provided the intelligence necessary for his location and capture, I had betrayed the being who'd risked everything to save my life when David Hartley's torture plans would have ended in my death in wilderness that swallowed victims without leaving traces for families to discover. The soul who'd demonstrated heroism that most humans never find courage to attempt was being transported to research facilities where he would spend whatever remained of his life as a test subject for studying consciousness and intelligence that existed in forms federal agencies had never been prepared to acknowledge. The Robertson case has provided the most significant intelligence breakthrough in cryptid research history. Morrison announced during debriefings that celebrated my cooperation while ignoring the moral implications of betraying someone whose protective intervention had saved my life from torture and murder. The witness testimony has enabled successful capture of specimens whose cognitive capabilities could provide strategic advantages if successfully analyzed and potentially replicated through technological development. Agent Morrison's final interview with me revealed the scope of federal operations that my innocent gratitude had enabled through providing information about cryptid territorial boundaries, family structures, and protective behavior that hunting teams had been seeking for decades, to validate reports about unknown hominid populations operating throughout Pacific Northwest wilderness. My detailed descriptions of Magnus's wisdom, medical knowledge, and obvious emotional sophistication had guided systematic elimination of protective presence that had made wilderness survival possible for countless victims who'd found themselves beyond the reach of human assistance. Your cooperation has advanced scientific understanding while contributing to national security operations that protect American citizens from potential threats posed by undocumented biological entities. Morrison explained, while I signed documents that classified my testimony and prohibited public discussion of federal activities related to cryptid capture and containment. The individual who intervened in your situation will receive appropriate care and study by qualified personnel who can determine his strategic value and potential applications for advancing human knowledge about consciousness and intelligence. But Morrison's reassurances about Magnus receiving appropriate care were lies designed to prevent witness remorse that might complicate future operations requiring civilian cooperation in locating and capturing cryptid populations throughout North American wilderness areas. Magnus wasn't destined for respectful study that might lead to peaceful coexistence. He was heading for underground laboratories where he would spend decades as a test subject for research, designed to unlock biological secrets that might provide military advantages that bureaucrats had been fantasizing about since the first credible cryptid reports crossed their desks. David Hartley was sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping, aggravated assault, and attempted murder, but his conviction was overshadowed by federal enthusiasm for the research opportunities that my case had provided through successful capture of beings whose existence represented strategic value that far exceeded whatever justice my victimization had deserved. My rescue had become a footnote to operations that would systematically eliminate protective presence from wilderness areas where Magnus's people had provided assistance that official records had never acknowledged. The liver disease that's killing me started forming the day I understood that my survival had cost Magnus his freedom, that my gratitude had condemned him to lifetime imprisonment, by people who would never comprehend that they were studying someone whose moral wisdom surpassed anything their institutions could imagine. For 42 years, I've lived knowing that somewhere in research facilities that don't appear on any public maps, the soul who chose to stand between me and David Hartley's torture has spent most of his remaining life as a laboratory subject being studied by people who will never understand that they're torturing someone who demonstrated the kind of selfless courage that defines true heroism. Magnus is probably 75 years old now, assuming he's survived 4 decades of medical experimentation, designed to unlock whatever biological mysteries his people might reveal about consciousness, intelligence, and potential strategic applications that federal agencies continue fantasizing about developing. My life was saved, but the price was destroying the most compassionate being who'd ever chosen to protect a human victim, when institutional protection had failed to prevent predatory violence. David Hartley died in prison 5 years ago, but Magnus continues suffering in laboratories where people who call themselves scientists study someone whose only crime was believing that innocent beings deserved protection, regardless of the species providing assistance or the personal costs such intervention might require.